My name's Benson Wang, and I'm a student at the Wheatley School in Long Island, New York. Today, I'll be presenting my research titled State Variation in Educational Placement for Students with Autism, National Individuals with Disabilities Education Act Trends from 2020 to 2024. This project examines how students with autism are placed into different educational settings across states, despite having the same federal special education laws. Specifically, I looked at whether students across the United States are truly receiving equal access to inclusive education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So, some background on the issue. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, was first passed in 1975 and guarantees that students with disabilities are entitled to free, appropriate public education. A critical part of this law is the concept of the least restrictive environment, or LRE. This means that students with disabilities should be educated alongside non disabled peers to the greatest extent that is appropriate. Before IDEA was passed, millions of students with disabilities were excluded from public education or educated in segregated settings. By 1974, more than 1.75 million children with disabilities received no educational services at all. So the idea was designed to correct this injustice, but the question remains: does this law lead to equal educational practice? So, what is autism spectrum disorder? Autism spectrum disorder, ASD, is a neurodevelopment condition that affects communication, behavior, and social interaction. The reason it's called spectrum is because symptoms vary widely from person to person. It might be very debilitating to one person, but to another, it might not be as severe. And common features of autism include challenges with social communication, repetitive behaviors, or perhaps sensory sensitivities. Autism is becoming more prevalent in the United States, according to research from the CDC in 2016. Around 1 in 54 children in the US are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, making it one of the fastest growing disability categories in public education. And because of this growth, educational placement decisions now affect millions of families across the country. So, although the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act guarantees students with autism a right to inclusive education, previous research has suggested that a child's state of residence and other external factors aside from a student's need for certain educational environments greatly influences their educational placement. So, state policies, funding systems, educational philosophy, district structure, and other factors have been found to have great impacts on what type of learning environment a student with autism is placed in. And the National Council on Disability has even described state funding systems as the single greatest factor influencing inclusion. So, despite federal mandates, inclusion, it has been found that students with the same disability may experience completely different educational systems simply because they live in different states. So, this led me to ask my two main research questions. One, how did educational placement trends for students with spectrum disorder differ across states in the United States? So, aside from the Individuals with Disabilities Act mandates that you know educational placement should be standard. However, I want to see how that actually varies across states when it is implemented, and I wanted to track how these patterns have changed from 2020 and 2021 to the 2023-2024 academic year to see kind of shifts in placement patterns. So, to answer these questions, I used Federal Individual with Disability Education Act Section 618 Part B data from the U.S. Department of Education. And from the IDEA Part B data file of each year of study, I extracted the number of public school students between ages 5 and 21 with autism, which was the group under study, and the count of those students served in each of the three inclusion placements defined. So this raw data was imported into RStudio, and from there I restructured the data to extract solely the autism disability category because the Individuals with Disability Act, it works with a ton of different disabilities, not just autism. So we had to make sure that that was the sole group under study. And this population of students with autism was further separated it into 3 distinct educational placements, which I will get into later, and cleaned in RStudio to calculate yearly percentages across each setting in each state and descriptive statistics. Once cleaned, the data for the 4 academic years were also merged into one data set in RStudio for data visualization. And data such as graphs are also produced via the RStudio package to IYRC using this data. So the U.S. Department of Education classifies students into 3 different groups. The students who spend over 80% of the day in general education, between 40 to 80% of the day, 40 to 79.99% of the day in general education, students attending fewer than 40% of the day in general education. And using these numbers explicitly given by them, I kind of categorize them into 3 subsections, which is either over 80%, which is classified as a highly inclusive environment, 40 to 79.99%, which was a partially inclusive environment, and a mostly separate environment was classified as under 40% of the day in general education. So here we could see at the national level results for how many students are placed in each environment type seem to remain stable. About 47% of students were placed in highly inclusive environments, 21% in partially inclusive environments, and 32 mostly separate environments. If we take a look at the line graph to the right. However, if we look at the box graphs, we could see that there's a large range and interquartile range, suggesting that national averages hide something important, which is the fact that there are huge differences in states between how they implement these different types of educational practices in terms of inclusivity. So in highly inclusive environments, as shown in the figures, there's wide state-by-state variation in highly inclusive educational placements, with outliers remaining persistent over time. We could see states like Nebraska, which consistently finished at the top in highly inclusive placements, placing over 60% of students in these highly inclusive environments, while states like New Jersey and New York consistently place under 40% of their students in highly inclusive environments. And it would be unfair to say that Nebraska simply has that many more students that need those type of services. So we can kind of see how geography and other factors might be influencing how educational placement is being brought about. So yeah, states with dense populations such as New York, Washington, D.C., and Jersey consistently place less than 40% of their students with ASD in highly inclusive environments. And these states tend to have larger and more urbanized school districts with broader access to specialized education services, which can have an effect on educational placement. Meanwhile, Midwestern states such as Nebraska, Indiana, South Dakota, and Wisconsin consistently ranked within the top 10 states in terms of the average percentage of students with ASD placed in highly inclusive environments. Overall, the 4-year trends indicate vast interstate variation in terms of how highly inclusive educational placement is implemented, despite the consistent national average of 46.68% to 47.06% of students being placed in these environments over the years. Now, in partially inclusive environments, the national average remained incredibly stable in part over the 4 years studied, ranging narrowly between 20.63% and 21.32%. So interestingly, many of the states ranking highest in partial inclusion, such as Missouri, Iowa, West Virginia, Kansas, Wisconsin, and Illinois, are located in the Midwest and South, suggesting regional trends in educational placement for students with ASD. On the other hand, states with large urban school systems like Florida, Texas, California, New York, Washington, D.C., etc., consistently rank low in partial inclusion percentages. And although there is variation in between states in how many students they place in partially inclusive environments, it isn't as profound as what we see in other states. Now, for mostly separate environments, the national mean for students with ASD placed in mostly separate educational environments saw little fluctuation, ranging from 31.62% to 32.58% over the 4-year period. The interquartile range similarly remain relatively stable between 12.71% and 13.7%. Um, New York, Delaware, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. consistently placed in the top 10 in terms of the percentage of students with ASC that are placed in mostly separate environments. Meanwhile, Midwestern states such as Wisconsin, the Dakotas, Kansas, and Minnesota consistently ranked in the bottom 15 states in terms of the percentage of students placed in such environments, showing how there is kind of long-standing discrepancies in how these different types of education are implemented. So several key factors appear to drive state variation. One is geography and urbanization. Urban districts tend to use more segregated models, often due to greater access to specialized programs and district size. Two, funding systems. Some states fund special education based on placement type, which may incentivize more restrictive environments. Others fund based on student need, encouraging inclusion. And three, politics, and as well as policies. States with different political and educational philosophies often adopt different ways of interpreting the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. For example, Midwestern states tend to be more inclusive, while Northeastern states lean towards specialized separate settings. In conclusion, despite stable national averages in how many students are being placed in each educational environment type, state variation persisted over time. Educational placement for students with autism is often seen to be influenced by factors such as geography, funding structures, and policy, not just student need. And as we can see here, although the Individuals with Disabilities Act does mandate that students should be educated in the least restrictive environment to the greatest extent possible, we could see that there are big discrepancies in how this is actually implemented. Here are my citations. Thank you so much for listening, and